is, well, I guess I was going to say that the culminating part of it, but it's actually, well, it's still got a plant after this. Probably better to eat than plant. So this is the traditional process of making pa'iai, or poi. A lot of misconceptions about, poi versus pa'iai, and it's very simple, and I'll lay it out very quickly and easily. Poi is the finished product after you take the pa'iai off the board into a umeke or a bowl, and you mix it with water, you ovali mikavai, and then you eat it. That is poi. As long as the kalo, the pounded kalo, is on the board, it is not poi, it is pa'iai. And so there's a lot of different stages, there's a lot of different techniques, there's a lot of different verbiage. The beauty about Hawaiian language is that, and a different type of kuleana that our ancestors had in the past, was that each kuleana or skill or practice or art had its own vocabulary. And so a kalo farmer had their own vocabulary. For example, I was showing some of the folks earlier when we were cutting the kalo away from the huli, or the ha, the stem, was the action of to kohi kalo. And kohi means to cut, is the action of cutting the kalo away from the stem when you're about ready to go and cook it. I had a chance we got my mentor, Kana'i Kiabi from the Big Island, who helped me with the walls, also is a master craftsman, and so he and I got a state foundation grant in 2002, and we got to travel all around the state to different museums, got to travel to the Peabody Museum in Boston to research out a lot of the different Hawaiian artifacts and traditional implements pertaining to kalo farming and poi making. And so we studied hundreds of poi pounders and hundreds of poi, different poi boards and the bowls and the o'o and all the different implements, and we were able to replicate all of those tools. So whether it was a different style of poi pounders to what is this very simple, looked like a paddle. It's just called the palau kohi, and the palau kohi was used as the knife. As simple as a knife to cut the kalo away. We know our kupuna didn't have metal tools, so they were using wood and stone. And so this tool, there were only two in existence, and they were both in the Bishop Museum, hanging on a wall. They weren't even, on display and so on. And when we found them, it just said palau kohi. So we kind of looked up the word, did some research on it, and it said in Mary Kavena Pukui's dictionary, tarot cutter. So we studied it, we looked at it, we measured it, we felt it, touched it, and looked, and how was this tool used to cut the kalo away from the stem? And so we replicated the tool using the traditional woods that were used for that one, which is kawila. And kawila is this same wood that I used to carve the o'o. But kawila was one of those woods that our kupuna would actually put into the lo'i for about a week or two, and it turns black, like ebony. So this is stained with lo'i mud for about a week to 2 weeks. And if you were to resend this off, that layer of black would come off and turn red again. It's a nice red. It's an endangered species, would actually highly endangered. But long story short, my former landlord worked for forestry in the Big Island. He had 3 good-sized logs under his house that he had for 20 years, and he didn't know what to do with it. And when he told me he had kawila, and I told my mentor about it, he's like, "Oh, that's like the best wood you can use. It's actually the hardest and most dense wood in the world, and it's a native dry forest plant. You can only find them on Big Island, Maui, and Kauai today." But so we got those remnant pieces. That's why this one's kind of cracked, because it came from an old fire in Kona, so it had some internal cracks and so on. We carved the tool, and we, after kind of analyzing it, we were like, how come it's, it's not perfectly flat? You think of a knife, right? Chef, you're cutting, you want something that's necessary, somewhat, straight, sharp. But this tool had kind of a convex edge to it and had this nice rollover on both sides. You can pass it around later so you can kind of see. And so I was spending some time with a kupuna in Waipio Valley on the Big Island, and when he was cutting his kalo, he had a regular knife, but when he put it into the the kalo and the stem, he did this action of snapping the kalo away. And I was looking at that, and he had reshaped his knife to kind of have this edge. And I had asked him, I said, you know, how come you not just using the regular knife, but you have this, you know, kind of, you know, convex edge, kind of roll over. He says when you cut the kalo away from the ha, or the stem, you want the base not to be necessarily flat as if you're cutting it with a knife, but you wanted the kalo to have this kind of rounded cut edge. And he said because when you put the kalo in the ground, in the, you know, in the lo'i, he was a kalo farmer that, you know, farmed in the lo'i. He said you don't want the base to completely touch the bottom because that's where the rot can begin. So like some kalo will rot out in the bottom, some don't. So he says if you have this cut where it's not perfectly flat and it's not completely touching the ground, and you have this kind of, I don't know what you call it, concave, you know, type of cut, then only the edges touch the base, and you won't have that necessarily that rot found. So then it came full circle, and I said, that's probably why the palau kohi is not perfectly flat. That's just my theory, and that was our theory at that time. And so I've been using the tool ever since. Of course, I use a knife. If we're, you know, harvesting like 40, 50 kalo, I'm not going to be sitting there all day with the palau kohi, but, you know, but I've used it, you know, for education, and I've tried it a number of times. So that's why it's kind of beat up and stuff. But it works really well. It's an art figuring out how to use it, but once you get it, works really well. So very important tool. Seems kind of insignificant, but to our kupuna, a tool such as this would have been something they use on an everyday basis. So palau kohi, you guys can pass it around. For the papaku'iai, which are the poi boards, there were 3 traditional woods that our kupuna used. One being ulu, which this board is made out of ulu from like these breadfruit trees. The second was ohi'alehua, which these beams are all made out of, or you know, our ohia wood. And the last one is ahakea, which is a dry forest species, a plant that's, it's not endangered, but it's pretty rare to find today. So ulu, when I was living in Hilo, there was a man down the road from where I was living cutting a ulu tree down, and we stopped on the side of the road, and I mean, normally people are not cutting ulu trees down, but this man wanted to build a garage right where the old ulu tree was, so we're like, wait, don't do anything with that wood. We'll get our chainsaws and come down, and he says, if you want to take the wood, you're more than welcome. So we made about 5 poi boards out of that. Most people today use mango as it's a good substitute, or monkey pod, but traditionally ulu would be the wood of choice along with ohia and ahakea. So, so I was able to carve this about 6-7 years ago. And then these poi pounders, most everybody's familiar with this style, right? Mm-hmm. If you've been to a museum, like the Bailey House Museum, you might have seen pohaku ku'iai that look like this. And these are 2 different unique styles of pohaku ku'iai that are carved, replicated from museum pieces on Kauai and here in Maui. These poi pounders, this one in particular is called the pohaku puka. It's got a puka ku'iai. And it was used with 2 hands and pounded like so, like that. And then after the left hand would come in pelu and fold the kalo again. Ku'i, ku'i, ku'i. But this was unique to the kupuna of Kauai. So if you go to Kauai or if you do any research on poi pounders, these pohaku ku'iai or pohaku puka ku'iai were unique and used by the people of Kauai only.
How did you find the stone? Is it a particular rock?
Yeah, you want the type of stone is called pohaku ala. Ala is a type of dense basalt stone that you want. You'll see people with pohaku ku'iai or even old ones that have a lot of pukas in them, and that's fine too. But stones that had this nice river stone that had you know, this nice dense, you know, not so many pukas are best used because when you ku'i, you don't want the kalo to get stuck inside, and that also you know, doesn't make for a good, you know, consistency as well as the actual process of making. So
when you went in the river, did you see the stone and say, there's
this one came from the Muliwai, or the river mouth of Wailuku River, and you want to find a stone that most likely submerged in the water. When it's, you know, just like anything else, when it's exposed to the elements or like the sun, it can crack. That's what happens, obviously, to rocks, you know, and soil, it just breaks down over time and time. But you want to find a stone that has as minimal internal cracks as possible. I've had poi pounders where I've carved them like 3/4 of the way through, and out came a crack, and it just
So was the stone like that?
Yeah, yeah. This particular stone probably would have been a nice egg-shaped stone.
And what tools do you use to?
Traditionally, the stones were carved with a kohi, or they were pecked. When we were doing this research, we found 3 pictures in the Bishop Museum from the late 1800s of a Hawaiian man making a poi pounder. It's the only records we've ever been able to find of anybody, or any photographs of them actually making it. He was making this style poi pounder, and what he was doing was, came from a stone, and this person who photographed it went through his whole process, which was probably the best thing we could ever have done to see how traditionally it was done. It was an oval-shaped stone, and what they were.
What is the original poi pounder?
Oh, sorry. This is the more common poi pounder. Good question. But what he had was, it was oval, and what he did was they pecked lines, going all the way, down each side. It reminds me of, I don't know if you ever saw, when I was a kid, I always relate things to things I saw. Close Encounters.
Yeah.
Remember when a guy in the movie is scraping that mountain? It's a real mountain, right? Somewhere, I don't know what the name of it is. I don't know if you ever saw Close Encounters. He's scraping the mountain, and he's making these little grooves, and that's what the guy was doing. He's making grooves. And then he was using, it looked like a hatchet. And as these grooves went maybe 1 inch deep on that stone, he would hit it and they would flake off, flake off, flake off. Then he went with another stone and he was pecking, peck, and he had a small adze and he was carving it, peck. And the final, which we still do today, even though we use modern tools like a diamond blade grinder, you have to finish the stone or the kuleana with abraders and with sand. So what we do is we have a kuleana, it's a grinding stone about this big. It's flat, has a little bit of indentation, and we go down to the beach, we put sand in it, put water, and we finish with the abraders. And that takes, with a modern grinder's diamond blade, I can whip something like this out in maybe 9 hours. But the final, making it so that you lose all those marks and stuff like that, takes an average of 10 to 20 hours. Just constant.
Bowl with the sand and the water.
And I have different abraders that does the inside. It takes a long time. You don't have to, but if you want it to look as traditional as possible, yeah. And this is about 10 years old now, so it almost looks like an old piece. And I made this one for the kids because when the kids come up,